Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Everyday Farmers Conference, all about getting started with small ruminants. Today, we are talking about breeding and pregnancy care. And today, we have Jacob Quiring and Kate Johnson, and they're going to be discussing all topics about breeding and pregnancy care. So, Jacob, can you start and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob Quiring. I am outside Boston. I work on a small sheep dairy. We have about 30 sheep that we breed every year. And we didn't milk this year, but we were milking last year. And I am the flock manager for a farm called Lillooet Sheep and Cheesery. Yeah, nice to meet you all.
Go ahead, Kate.
All right, I'm Kate Johnson. I'm out in Colorado, just outside of Boulder, and I have a small dairy goat farm, Briargate Farm. We raise Nubian dairy goats. It's a small, really mostly a hobby herd. We have about 10 does right now and a couple of bucks and some useless but very affectionate wethers. And then I also run a cheese making school. And so I'm right now teaching virtually and not in person. And I'm also an active leader within our local 4-H program. And I'm a superintendent for our local fair in the goat program. And I also write for Goat Journal, Countryside Network's publication. So we've been doing dairy goats for about, I think we're going into our 13th season.
So Kate, how many acres do you guys have?
We just have 5 acres. We're in Boulder County, and so that's considered a farm here. It's kind of considered a big yard in some areas, but 5 acres.
Okay. And then Jacob, can you talk about how many acres you have, how many seasons you've bred?
So we have about 15 to 20 acres of pasture. The property is a little larger. But most of it is wooded. So we use some of the wooded areas for off-season loafing areas when we're not grazing or we don't want the sheep on the grass because it's getting too low. In terms of breeding, this is the 3rd year that I've been breeding this particular flock. So still plenty to learn, but you figure a few things out as you go on each year.
And what's your ratio of ewes to rams?
So this year we are breeding with 2 different rams, and we are breeding, 27 ewes. The reason we're doing 2 is that our main dairy ram has, this is our 3rd season with him, so we've got offspring of his, so we don't want to breed back to him. So we are using a Icelandic ram to breed his offspring.
And do you have any wethers, or is it just 2 full guys, full rams?
Our wethers always get shipped off for slaughter by this time of year, unless we need one for companions. So we've kept them in the past because we always separate our rams when we're not using them in the flock. But since we've got 2 different breeding rams right now, they keep each other occupied, so we don't have any wethers.
All right, cool. Can you guys talk a little bit about what you guys do pre even getting the rams in there? So this would be like either prepping your breeding pasture or like timing wise, what you guys are planning for. When do you guys breed so that you guys have your animals in, whichever month you're looking for. I don't think have you guys done AI at all?
We have somebody local that will do AI for us. So we have done AI a few times over the years, but most of the time we do live cover with our own bucks.
Okay. So you can kind of talk about the AI process too. So if you guys could just kind of do, I guess, the pre-introducing the ram into the I've got my pacifier into the pasture. That'd be great. And either one of you guys can start.
You can go ahead, Jacob. I'll defer to you, and then I'll go second.
Okay. I guess Since we're breeding each year and we're doing some replacements, I start thinking about what ewe lambs I want to keep back and what ones are being sent out for slaughter. So that's information or thought process that starts happening in the summer. But we always plan to do breeding in November so that we get our lambs in April when the weather has gotten nicer. We do lambing inside, but the weather isn't as terrible. So starting in late fall, I've selected the lambs and ewes that I want to keep. And then the first really big step is going through all the ewes and just making sure that they have the proper body condition. So anyone that's too thin, evaluating why they're too thin. If they're getting old, checking teeth to make sure that there isn't physiological reason or other reason why they won't be able to make body condition. If it was just a lack of feed, then making sure they have the proper feed. And, there's a score you can do for body condition from 1 to 5. I like to have them between 3 and 3.5. Checking eyes to make sure that they are not anemic from internal parasites. And I like trimming their hooves just so that they don't have any hoof issues. And then for the rams, similar issue, taking a look at them, making sure that they have good body condition. The rams, I usually will up their grain a little bit since they don't really get that much while they're just hanging out in the summer and spring. So I don't want them to be fat, but I don't want them skinny because they've got a lot of work ahead of them. Checking their eyes to make sure that they're not suffering from worms. And then hooves is one that I feel like I always don't get on top of enough. Especially like our dairy ram is getting kind of heavy. They are larger animals. I suspect he's probably 350 pounds. And as soon as the days start getting shorter and they start romping around and mounting each other, their hooves get a lot of pressure. And so they tend to crack a bit. So getting those trimmed up early usually makes that a lot easier. I think that's probably the most important part. And then because we've got some that are related, dividing the ewes up so that I don't have the fathers breeding daughters. I think that's the basics of what I do to prepare for November. Yep.
Yeah, so I would say our situation is somewhat similar, although so much smaller, that since we're only usually, I'm bred 8 this year, or will have, I have 2 left to go. And because we are milking them at the time that they're getting ready to be bred, we're already pretty involved with them, so we're keeping up with hoof trimming and watching body condition and all of that. But in the case that I do have a doe that, like Jacob said, that's a little under or even a little over, because sometimes being overweight also can make it a little harder, but we're pretty much monitoring that a lot throughout the season because we're milking them. And then we do have father-daughter issues. So we keep 2 different bucks from 2 different lines and we rotate them out about every 3 years. And then we do have a local breeder who will supply us with AI or other bucks in the case that we want to introduce some new genetics, or we just timing wise, it doesn't work or what have you. So, and then we have a separate barn where our bucks live. So we have 2 bucks and 4 wethers over there to keep them company. Although once they go into rut, the bucks have to kind of get separated out, but they're right next door to each other. So we actually take the does to the bucks. When it's time to breed, we hand breed because it allows us, well, ultimate control of timing and genetics, but also by hand breeding and getting our does over there really early in their heat cycle, we increase our ratio of doelings to bucklings in the kidding season. So we can talk about that more in a little bit. At any rate, let's see, there was one other thing I was going to say about that, but it's just left my brain momentarily.
When you were speaking, I realized I forgot to mention. So since we have a few more animals, we bring the rams to the ewes. And I think a difference with sheep and goats is that I find it harder to tell when a sheep is in heat. If it's just the ewes hanging out, I I mean, I'll start seeing them pushing each other around, but it is kind of difficult to tell which one is in heat for me. So I've worked with cows before, and you always know what's going on. But with sheep, that's much more difficult. So if you want to do more hand breeding with sheep, I know in the past, what we've done is we've kept a ram in a pen among the ewes. So if the ewes were in a barn, having a ram there, then you can tell much easier, because once the ewes are in heat, then they become very interested in the ram. They hang around and, they're just trying to get close to him. Whereas the rest of the time, they might not really care at all, and they'll just go do their own thing. So I think it's a little bit harder with sheep to do the hand unless you've got them right side by side.
Yeah, so, and thank you for saying that, because that helped me remember what I was going to say. That's probably the most important thing that we do getting ready, is we start tracking heat cycles. So I'm usually planning out, I tend to like to spread out my kiddings in the spring, primarily for space reasons, but also when we are open to the public, which of course this spring we weren't, and who knows if we will be next spring. But one of the big attractions, of course, is seeing baby goats when people come to cheese making classes. So we try to spread out the babies. So we start in March. We try to kid about every 3 weeks, March, April, May, sometimes into June. And then we're also looking at when that doe started her milk production and when we plan to dry her off, because she can be in milk for the first 3 months of her pregnancy, but we need to dry her off for the last 2 months. So I've usually kind of planned out who I want bred to who and when for the kidding season. And so, like you said, Jacob, the goats generally are a lot easier to track heat cycles. They're extremely vocal. And because the bucks, when they go into rut, are extremely stinky, the does are really attracted to that side of the pasture. They're separated by a big yard, and but they can smell them, and so it makes it really easy for me to tell when the does are in heat, because they'll go to the furthest edge of the pasture and just look longingly toward the buck barn and scream and wag their tail. So it's pretty easy to track their heat cycles when you have bucks on the property. And so usually I'm tracking their cycles for a few cycles before I start breeding. And then I pretty much have a schedule that so far this year has been going like clockwork. Everybody is going exactly when they're supposed to. And with live cover, with proven bucks and proven does, you have probably a 95% success rate in your first breeding. So.
Yeah. Yeah, with sheep, trying to track cycles would be fairly difficult. Like I said, they will hang out by the rams, but they generally do not vocalize. The rams also do not pee on themselves, so while they will have a little bit of a stronger odor than the ewes do, they generally are a little calmer in that regard. The one thing I forgot to mention is that a lot of people, or some people who have sheep, will do flushing, which is feeding extra grain or whatever you have for energy at least 2 weeks ahead of breeding. And the idea is that that will increase the number of lambs that you will get, or there will be a larger conception rate. Since we are working with East Frisian dairy sheep, they have a higher number of lambs statistically. So we generally expect 200% return. So at least twins, there'll be some singles, quite a few triplets. So I don't do any flushing just because I don't want them to have all triplets or quads, which are not unheard of. It just becomes a lot of work. We need to then bottle feed because it's just hard for you to raise 4. If nothing else, it's hard for 4 to get at a ewe to be fed. And then sometimes they reject one, or one of them becomes a runt and can't get at it. So we don't do flushing, but if you have a different breed, I know that for some sheep farmers, that's an important way to increase the number of lambs they get.
Yeah, and I'm guessing goats, I've heard the term, and some goat people do that, but at the level that we're at, and we almost always get twins or triplets, and like you said, occasional singles and occasional quads. And so we don't do that either. Also, because my bucks really don't work that hard. I mean, I'm only breeding 7 or 8, and I've got 2 bucks. I don't change their nutrition very much going into breeding season. We do some outside breeding but not enough for them to really need a lot more nutrition. But like all of the animals, we keep an eye on them. And if somebody's not looking thrifty enough or right during breeding, we may give them a little bit extra.
Now, is every time they cycle, I believe with the sheep, it's every 2 weeks, correct?
Yeah.
Because I have breeding too.
Yeah, I was going to say that I kind of assume it's going to be anywhere between 14 and 16 days. So since I have the ram in with a group of ewes, I use a marker to help me keep track, which is a harness that gets put on the ram, and there's a crayon that gets attached that's on the brisket. So when they mount, they leave a mark on the back of the sheep. So I change that at day 13 just to be safe, so I can tell if there's rebreeding, which helps me keep track of the dates. I recently saw a farmer who spray painted the back of the ewes instead. So I guess that's another way of doing it. And you just keep an eye on that being smeared. But I haven't experimented with that.
Yeah, and our heat cycle is every 3 weeks. Some does it's more like 18 days, and some it's more like 22 days, but roughly every 3 weeks. But again, since we're hand breeding, we pretty much know who daddy's going to be and whether they bred or not. And then what I do is once they've been bred, I make a note to be keeping a close eye on them around 3 weeks later. And if they don't go into heat, then we're pretty sure they've been bred. That gets a little harder at the end of breeding season because they'll stop cycling about toward the end of January, February. And so then if you're breeding that late in the season, that just tracking heat cycles may not be enough to tell you whether they've been bred or not. We do pregnancy testing too, which I know is another question we'll be answering in a little bit here.
Yeah, for us, we tried the harness, but I think we did it too early because the chalk went down really fast and I didn't see like anything on. And I was like, is it the rain or something? Like, what happened? We hit a lot and then all of a sudden it disappeared. And so then we tried, someone suggested a powder combined with either some kind of oil, coconut oil, extra virgin olive, vegetable, whatever you have. And so we started doing that. But yeah, when it comes to sheep, it's confusing because one of my girls has been marked 3 different times and it's the same girl. And I'm like, you're either not taking or he's just being amorous, because my girls they're pretty feisty. So he'll try to mount them and they run off. Even like when I think they're in heat, they're still like, get away from me. I'm like, okay, you guys need to figure this out. So we can talk about a little bit of how long do you guys keep your males in there for? I know you guys said that you guys schedule them kind of sometimes. I think Jacob, you kind of keep them in there, and then Kate, because you're hand doing it, you're kind of selecting which girls you're in there with. But how long do you keep the males in there when they're in there?
You want to go first, Kate?
Sure. So in order to increase our doeling to buckling ratio, we catch them early in the heat cycle. So as soon as I notice them being in heat, we'll take them over to the buck. And sometimes you catch it a little too early and they're not in standing heat yet. And so if they're running from the buck, usually we'll just wait a few hours and then bring them back again, because it can really literally be just a matter of a few hours. And then we leave them in there just for usually about 30 to 40 minutes. I like to see them breed 3 times. That's kind of my magic number. And some bucks, get recharged quicker than others. And then we take them away. So it's just a quick little conjugal visit, and then that's it for the year. So that it's pretty short and sweet. When we didn't used to do it that way. We used to pen breed. And so we would bring the does over there and leave them for their full heat cycle, thinking we would get a better chance of them getting bred. And they always got bred, but we always had more boys than girls at kidding time. And so by doing it early in the cycle like this, because the sperms that carry the boy chromosome swim faster, and so they're more likely to impregnate her, but the girl sperms live longer. So if you can get the doe in there early in her heat cycle before she's ovulated, by the time she does ovulate, that's more likely that it'll be the girl sperms still living to fertilize. So since we've been doing it that way for the last 3 years, and we've always had a higher doeling to buckling ratio, and prior to that, it was always the reverse. So it's only increasing your ratio. There's no way to get all girls, but if we can get a few more does out of the kiddings, that works well for us. And because we do have the bucks right here on the property, that's pretty easy for us to be able to schedule those quick visits.
I think I briefly mentioned, so I keep them in the rams in with the ewes at least 4 weeks, a little bit over. So first 2 weeks should be the initial breeding, and then I change the marker on day 12 or 13 to a different marker and leave them in for another 2 weeks, a little bit over. And that should have cleaned up anyone that didn't get bred the first time. If you want, you can leave them in a little bit longer to make sure that second breeding did take. I guess that'd be another 2 weeks, but my general philosophy is if they didn't get bred in 2 cycles, particularly if we were in the center, in November when they should be cycling well, then there might be other issues, or if they're having a hard time conceiving, then I probably don't want the offspring anyway, in case there's any kind of genetic factor to that. So for anyone that don't get bred within 2 cycles, they typically get shipped off in the spring, so they don't get another chance. And since we have more sheep, we usually have that flexibility to send off anyone that didn't get bred in 2 cycles. And in terms of, you mentioned gender ratio, that can be, we've had really all over the place. We had 2 years where it was almost all males. We only had a couple of females. And then the last 2 years, we've been really lucky, and it's been a very nice even split. So very close to 50-50 male female, which is what we like, because we want some females, but we also sell meat, rams or meat lambs, and males will grow slightly faster than females. So that can be nice. Yeah. And
do you guys find the rams or the bucks get aggressive towards the pregnant ewes, or do they just kind of leave them alone?
Well, in our case, since they don't live next to each other at all, they don't have any interaction. I do know some dairy goat breeders that will, after everybody's bred and after the bucks are out of rut, will let them all live together. But just from a space standpoint, we just don't really have a reason to do that. So the boys have their own pasture and their own barn, and the girls have their own space. And so it's a lot easier for us just to always keep them separate. I do find that when the bucks are younger, they can go back to all living together after breeding season. But once they get a little bit older, they stay fairly aggressive even when they're not in rut. And so we have them separated into separate pens. So like this year, we have a younger buck that he may be able to go back and live with the wethers after breeding season is over, but we'll just kind of play it by ear and see how aggressive he's being with them.
With the rams, from my experience, having worked with 4 of them now, it really depends on the animal. We had one, he was very aggressive with the ewes, but he also was aggressive with people. So he had to go to freezer camp. But we always separate our rams just because working with the ewes is much easier when you don't have to worry and don't have to think about getting rammed by an animal. And with a ram, while you may have the friendliest ram, you should never assume that they are safe, or you shouldn't turn your back to them, because they can be very hormonally driven, and it doesn't have to be intentional. I know our current ram, he's sweet, but last year when I was breeding, I was in the barn with him. I didn't think about it, and I was closing a door, and I got between him and a ewe, and he was behind me, and he touched me, and I just put my hand behind me against his face, not thinking about it while I was closing the door. And in that time, he backed up and, pushed me from behind. It wasn't hard, but it's just an example of if they aren't doing a job in there, it's just better to keep them in a separate pen, so that to keep an eye on them when you're working with them, and the rest of the time you don't have to worry about it, which is safer for you, but especially if you have visitors or if you have other people doing chores for you, it's just better to keep them separate and to know how you treat them when you're working with them.
Yeah, and that is a really good point. I mean, similarly, our bucks are friendly. They were hand raised when they were born, but they do get aggressive too. And we do have volunteers on the farm, so we don't have the volunteers going in and cleaning the buck areas just from a safety precaution, especially not during breeding season.
Yeah, we just had my mom come out to help us with the animals while we had our little one. And she was out there. We keep the sheep in a barn right now because we do have a livestock guardian dog, but she's still a puppy. So they sleep in a barn at night just for protection. And so someone's got to go out and release them. And he's in there with them now. And she was saying that she was closing one of the gates and he kind of bumped her from behind. And he'd never done that to me, but like when I was pregnant, like uber pregnant, I was like, I'm not dealing with the sheep right now because they're breeding, and the last thing I need is for him to bump me or to push me over or something. So it's definitely like, he's one of the sweetest rams that I think I've ever met, but when breeding happens, they're a whole different animal, and it's like, it can turn on a dime. Because he was absolutely fine, and then all of a sudden she gets hit, and I was like, oh no. Luckily she was fine, and like you said, it wasn't a big hit. It just was a little bit of a territorial, like, hey, I'm here. So one of the things, because we're talking about behavior, I noticed that at least with my ram, he does a lip thing when he's talking to the girls. He'll like lift it up, and he'll start grunting and following them around and sniffing their rear. And so I kind of wanted to just talk about kind of what some of the things you've noticed in the like minor behavioral changes that you see in either the ewes or the males and the females of the sheep and the goats, where you're like, oh yeah, it's coming, or I need to watch for this, or make sure I mark it, because at least with sheep, even if you don't see them actually do the deed, sometimes you'll mark just because you're like, I'm noticing these behaviors. I know we've talked about little bits here and there, but if you guys could just kind of explain a little bit of like what you guys see when this is happening.
So when the breeding itself is happening. Yeah, so it's really, really obvious with the goats. You kind of can't miss it. And of course, on both sides. I mean, so the does are pretty obvious when they're in heat, and they pretty much want absolutely nothing to do with the buck, except for in this window when they're breedable. So the standing heat, I'd say for my average doe, they're in heat for 2 to 3 days, but they're in standing heat for maybe half of that time. So sometimes at the beginning of heat, they're not. And so I have some bucks that are a little bit more at courtship than others, so sometimes if she's early in the cycle, which is when I want to get her bred and I take her over there, she may run away from him for the first few minutes. But if the buck is somewhat, patient, but also assertive, he'll often bring her around. And so that does kind of look a little, it's different than just chasing. Like the just chasing nonstop and her running nonstop, that's pointless. Like that's just going to make everybody, tired and lose weight and stressed and possible injuries. So if that's happening, we're not in the right window. But if she's a little bit reluctant and he's super interested, a lot of times there is a lot of verbalizations, but also he's, licking her and pawing at her and generally wooing her. And sometimes, she'll come around. But as far as the act itself, it's super obvious. And so, but sometimes you're not seeing the actual connection. So what I always tell people when they're just watching and trying to say, did it happen, is when he's actually penetrated her, the buck will usually throw his head back and the doe will hunch her back. And those two things together let you know that they have connected. So usually I'm looking for that, and I like to see that 2 or 3 times just to make sure that we're good to go. So those are some of the things, I guess, that are physical signs that we see.
Kate, would you mind explaining what you mean? Maybe it sounds obvious, but someone who hasn't worked with animals before, what you mean when you say standing heat?
Yeah, so when the doe's in heat, she'll start vocalizing and she's flagging her tail. Sometimes you'll see a little discharge. Usually by the time they're at that point, when they go to the buck and he wants to breed her, they'll actually stand for it. So that's why it's called standing heat. Sometimes early in the cycle, or if you've kind of missed that at the end, they're standing over and they're maybe wagging a little and being vocal, but when they get over to the buck, they're really not interested and they'll just run from them. Sometimes, especially with the older does and the younger bucks, the does will be really mean to the buck. I mean, they're headbutting them and they're just like, you are disgusting, get away from me. And then, 6 hours earlier or 6 hours later, they're like, oh, you're the best thing that ever happened. So that's kind of what standing heat is, when they stand and they're cooperative.
So for the sheep, I think there's certainly little to no vocalizing when they are breeding, but in other ways, very similar to the goats, that the ewes are not interested in the ram until they are in heat. Particularly when you just introduce the ram, they will run away. And, he's trying to chase them. He's trying to smell their urine and doing the lip curl to sample, see if they are in heat or not. And we'll start, trying, doing the little, the licking them with the lips and pawing with the front paw. And the ewe may pay some attention if she's just starting heat or almost done, but like the goats, won't stand to be mounted. So it takes when she's at the middle of the cycle before she will stand for the ram. I've never noticed any particular behavior or any particular responses to suggest that it was successful breeding, other than just a number of times when the ewe was willing to stand while the ram was mounting. Seeing a few of those, you're probably a good chance that the breeding was successful, but it certainly will not happen if the ewe is not in heat and not interested. I think that was it. Yeah.
Oops, we're not hearing you, Delaney.
Yeah, your audio disappeared.
Uh-oh, she just disappeared. Well, we can open our chat box again if you want to type in a question. So, okay, so she's asking, how do you guys know when the girl is pregnant? So I'll start with that. So our first sign, like I mentioned, is that because it's pretty obvious for the goats when they are in heat, first thing we're doing is just watching to see if they cycle again in 3 weeks. Every now and then you'll have a doe, though, that will short cycle. And so that can kind of throw you off a little bit, because they all of a sudden act like they're in heat 10 days later, and it's not a real heat. So that can kind of mess things up a little bit. But generally, I'm just watching for them to go into heat again. And then I have 2 other methods that we'll use just to make it a little more definite. We can do an ultrasound, and usually we wait till at least 40 days post-breeding for that. And of course, that involves the vet coming out, and usually they can tell if they're pregnant or not, but sometimes they miss it if it's early on, and they can't usually tell you exactly how many kids And so, and because of the timing of me spreading it out so much, I really try to minimize how many times I'm having the vet out to do an ultrasound. So usually I mostly am tracking it by heat cycles. And then once I have everybody bred, I'm going to do my annual CAE testing, which is our annual blood test for Quiring arthritis encephalitis, which is kind of our big thing that we test for every year. And as long as I'm drawing blood for that, I'll go ahead and have a pregnancy test run on that same blood sample. And so then I can just confirm for sure. Most of the time, by the time I'm doing that, though, I'm 90% sure anyhow that they're pregnant. But if I do that early enough, usually I'm doing that about January, I may still have time to catch a doe and have her bred if she turns up for some reason to be negative. And sometimes there can be an early miscarriage that could have happened that you thought they were bred, but that's pretty unusual for us. So I've just found that those two methods, some years I don't do it at all. I don't do any pregnant testing, and I just wait and do my CAE testing before kidding. And by then it's too late to run a preg test anyhow. So yeah, so I guess that those are our techniques.
So we, I mean, as Kate mentioned, and as I think I mentioned, I keep track of with the marking when breeding happened. So, first cycle, if they were bred, I put that date down, and then second cycle, if there was breeding again, I record that date as well. And when I get to lambing, I always keep an eye out for that first date if they were bred again a second time, because as Kate mentioned, sometimes you will get short cycles, which means they will come back into heat and you think, oh, they were rebred again. But then you come to lambing and they have their lamb and that first breeding, and so you know that they were pregnant then. But we don't do any testing. Partially, we are too small to do that. I know for sheep farmers, larger operations are more likely to test because they're trying to save on feed by feeding based on whether they've got twins, triplets, or singles, or maybe quads. So ultrasound testing is one way of doing it. Some vets will do it for you. It can be a little expensive to do that. So if it's worth it for you for feed saving, or if you just want to know, if you're okay paying the cost, you can do that. I think our vet was talking around 90 days, but you should check with your vet when that would be best for sheep. You can do blood tests as well and send them off to your local lab, and they will tell you. We don't do that either. So mostly if we've got breeding that was marked, I assume they're pregnant. And then when we get close to lambing, I keep an eye on if they are starting to bag up to suggest that they were pregnant. Sheep, I think, are more prone to early miscarriages than goats are. So one of the recommendations is that you don't change any kind of routine or the way they're handled for the first month or so after breeding, because they are the most vulnerable at that point. So if you didn't have dogs within there before, certainly don't bring in any dogs. If you had someone do chores, don't bring in someone new who might really, not be used to sheep and scare them or whatever, or chase them around or things like that, since they are more prone to losing their pregnancy early on. Sheep do most of their development in the last trimester, so certainly the first trimester, they're more, it's easier for them to just abort their lamb, and you wouldn't know it because it's so small.
Yeah, and I would say it's similar for goats, but not as dramatic, and similar to what Jacob said. If we do rebreed, whether it was at 3 weeks or a short cycle, we also do keep track of both dates, because sometimes it was a false heat and they really were already bred. So we're always on the lookout, and the earlier date first.
Yeah. mean, if you really like technology, you can buy your own ultrasound for home use and learn to use it. I certainly know some sheep farms who do that. But again, it's a question of if you want to spend the money, and are you doing it for your own entertainment or education, or is it an economical thing where it's worth you learning and paying for the cost of it to save on feed or things like that? Yeah.
Is my audio back?
Yes, you are.
Cool. I've also seen people do the heartbeat, you know, like when women buy the stuff for their stomach so they can hear their own heartbeat. I've heard some people use those for sheep. They probably can use it for goats too, but just in the sheep groups that I'm a part of, some people have bought them and can hear a heartbeat. You can't tell how many sheep, like how many are in there, but you can at least sometimes hear a heartbeat. I've never tried it, but from what I've heard from other people, some have success, some don't. It probably depends on your knowledge of their anatomy and where you're placing it. Some places, like if you try to get it through some of the wool, it's probably not going to work. But if you try like the skin underneath them, it might work a little bit better. But yeah, if you don't want to go full ultrasound, because I've looked at those, those are expensive. You can try some of the like heartbeat stuff, because I think those run anywhere from like 40 to 80. Sometimes you can get them even less. It's just the cheaper you go, the less they probably work. So that's an option too if people wanted to try to kind of guess if they don't want to do blood work or anything like that.
Do you know? Sorry, do you know when they'd be able to hear that? So I have not tried the heartbeat before. I'm wondering whether that'd be fairly late in the pregnancy because of the development.
Do they call them trimesters in the animal kingdom? I would think it'd be like I guess what the equivalent would be is like the second trimester, like they're already pretty advanced. I don't know when they did it, and like when the person who tried it did it, but I would think it would be probably whatever the equivalent of a second trimester is for sheep. But I know, like, even with the blood tests and stuff, you have to kind of have a window of whether it's going to work. I don't know if there's like an end, like, you know, if you go too far, you can't tell blood work wise. Someone told me that there's like a window, and I was like, but if they're pregnant, are they just pregnant like throughout? And if you send any of the blood work after a certain point, when they come back positive or negative? But maybe you guys can speak to that, because to me, I'm like, well, you're gonna be pregnant. Just at some point, it would just test positive, right? But yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that, other than, I guess for me, at some point, it's kind of obvious physically. And so then I probably wouldn't be bothering to do a test. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if there's a later end for the blood test, whether it works or not for goats.
I don't know either. I had a brief conversation with the vet last year, and I remember he recommended a particular window for testing, but either your vet or the lab that you're getting tested, or you plan to send your sample to, would be able to tell you the preferred window for sheep.
So what are some of because Kate, you said it, you could tell like the physical signs. I would think that at least for sheep, because of the wool, that sometimes it's harder to tell physical changes, especially since they seem to be pregnant a lot during winter, so their coats would be a little bit more full. Whereas for goats, their wool or their fur or whatever hair, they wouldn't be as thick, and so maybe you could tell the kind of curves of the stomach and stuff. Can you guys speak to maybe that? Whether it is easier or harder, and why it would be easier or harder?
Yeah, so in our case, we raise Nubian goats, and they are a breed that doesn't get super woolly in the winter. We used to raise Nigerian dwarfs, and they were a lot harder to tell because they did get a lot thicker coats. And I would say it's probably not a real scientific method, you know, but because we are pretty in tune, we have such a small herd and we know them pretty well, just that change, it's pretty, we usually just can tell the difference. And usually it's, by about 3 months that they just start looking fat. I mean, that's all I can say. They're just fatter than they would be in the middle of the winter. When they're not in milk. We don't usually change feed a lot ourselves until the last month of pregnancy. We typically are feeding a mix of grass hay and alfalfa, or grass hay and alfalfa pellets during pregnancy. Not a lot of grain, because we don't want them to gain weight too fast or for those babies to get too big. It makes kidding harder. But in the last month, when their nutritional needs are higher, but also we're ramping up to higher nutritional needs once they do deliver, we do start introducing grain again, and kind of doing it gradually so that we don't get into a grain overload situation. So mostly the physical change is just, it's not maybe quite as pronounced as a pregnant human because they're not carrying it in front. It's on the sides, but it is just that they are putting on weight more than anything, and that it's mostly being on their, around their belly, basically, as opposed to, their top line getting really fat or their brisket getting really full. It really is belly weight. And it's just each individual doe will do it a little bit differently and look a little differently, but generally we can tell just because we know them, individually.
So for sheep, trying to tell physically whether they're pregnant is very difficult, especially because our pregnancy tends to coincide with when they have the most wool. So they will just be getting larger through the winter because they're getting larger. They're growing a lot of wool on them. So they might look pregnant to you, but they may not be. It's just wool. You could try to feel through the wool, but because the lambs do not really grow that much until the last 4 to 6 weeks, it's very unlikely that you would be able to tell by trying to massage them whether they were pregnant or not. I have been fooled by sheep that I thought were pregnant, that they were just getting fat. They were just getting a lot of wool. In terms of feeding, our sheep are on a maintenance, so they get a little bit of prepared grain pellet when they are being bred, and the first 2 months, because they don't need a lot of energy, and we don't want them getting fat, so they don't get much until the last 6 to 4 weeks. So if someone wasn't pregnant, they could be getting chubby in that last 6 weeks because they are not growing any lambs and they are getting feed as though they are. And that can also cause fatty udder, or for them to collect fat in their udder, which can also fool you into thinking that, oh, they're starting to bag up, but then they never really go further beyond being a little bit fatty there. But the last 4 weeks, if they are pregnant, some of them you'll start seeing their udder expanding a little bit. It gets a little red, and then the closer you get, the more it will expand, and that's your best indicator if you're only looking physically, but it's towards the end, unfortunately.
So can you guys talk a little bit about what some of the pitfalls or problems you face when you don't feed them the proper nutrition, whether it's too much or too little, maybe some of the problems that can arise from going either way?
Yeah, so obviously, if you're overfeeding and the babies are really large, it can just make a more difficult delivery. And if we're underfeeding, or for some reason the doe isn't getting all her nutritional needs met, sometimes you will have weaker kids that just require a lot more support, or the dam herself will not be in good enough condition to weather a difficult labor. So kind of an obvious, I guess, even compared to any animal, just proper nutrition is important, and not just from a feed standpoint, but from a mineral supplement standpoint as well. We always leave out free choice goat minerals, and we get a brand that is specifically formulated for our part of the country. because different soils have different deficiencies. And because it's free choice, the does are pretty good about monitoring it themselves of what their bodies need. And so I think that's just a really easy thing to overlook, because we're always thinking of, you know, roughage and grains and water, but we don't always remember that mineral component.
Yeah, similar for sheep. We increase our rations the last 4 to 6 weeks. We don't want to get them fat because that can cause difficulty for lambing as well. I don't know if I've noticed so much in terms of lamb size. For the sheep, the number of lambs has a huge indicator on the size. So our singles are always too big, and it's hard. I don't know that we can do anything about that. So I don't really like when we get singles. And then if you're at the other end, you get quads, you know, you'll get really small lambs where you're much more worried about them surviving in terms of getting enough energy. Minerals are very important during this time. So we also do free choice sheep minerals. And in the last 4 weeks, they just go through it like crazy. And that's great. So in the Northeast, we are selenium deficient, which is a very important mineral that they need for their white muscle cells. So if you didn't feed that, then you might need to vaccinate with vitamin E. Let's see, calcium will be part of the minerals or part of your feed, which is another important mineral for them as they are growing the bones of their lambs, which the mother, like any animal, will start losing as the lamb is growing.
Yeah, and we add to our free choice minerals sea kelp. And so the sea kelp also has a lot of protein, and that really helps them just from a nutritional standpoint without having to load them up with a lot of calories. And it also just makes the minerals a little more palatable to them. They really like the sea kelp a lot. And so by mixing it kind of half and half, I think they're a little bit more encouraged to eat it. It also really helps with their coats. So we do that blend, both of those things, free choice.
The one thing I would say about minerals, I know with certain animals, people will separate the different kinds of minerals and the idea that the animal can choose what they want. I have not experimented with that with sheep. I would probably caution against that. I'd suggest you talk to your vet before you do something like that, just because I know our minerals have salt in them, which is what attracts the sheep to it and why they lick so much of it. So don't have separate salt licking around, because they will just go for the salt and they will then not get enough of the minerals. And then you will most likely have issues with your lambs, and also with lambing if they're low on selenium, that they don't have the muscle capacity to deliver the lamb, or the lamb when it's born will be have muscle problems.
Another thing that I wanted to add that I remember in one of the talks that I've had is, at least when you have an underweight animal, especially because it seems like, I think all of us milk or milking our animals, that it's really hard to gain weight once the babies have come. So at least for underweight animals, it's really important, at least before they have the babies, to try to get their weight up. Just because once they're, once the babies come and are eating off of them, it's really, or, you know, we're pumping the milk ourselves, it's really hard for them to gain any weight after that. And then there was another thing. I lost it. Maybe I'll come back. Maybe it'll come back to me. Have you guys had any weight issues with your animals to the point where you decided not to breed them?
Yeah, I do have one doe that she's an older doe, and she's from a line that is just harder to keep weight on. And and she is one that it's impossible to put weight on her when she's in milk, because she's a big milker. And so I have given her a year off some years. Usually we're breeding every year until they get to a certain age. But when she had the year off, then I could really get her weight back up again before we would breed her again. Or in some cases with her, I might breed her early one year and then dry her off before I breed her for the next year and breed her late that year. Now I don't like that trait in a herd. And so I usually don't actually keep her offspring for that reason, just because she's a really good show goat. And so there are people that care more about the show quality than the milk ability. But she's just from a line that I like her personally, but I usually don't keep her offspring. And I tend to breed up my other line, which are much thriftier and much easier to keep weight on. Yeah, so, and I think Jacob spoke to that too, about culling those that have the genetics that you don't like. Unfortunately, we're so small and we're almost more, I would say our animals are somewhere between pets and livestock. So it's a little harder for us to make some of those tough decisions. But I think it is a good management practice overall.
Yeah, if you're keeping ruminants or small, and particularly small ruminants for dairy, you're walking a fine line between they don't produce a lot of milk. So an animal that produces more milk typically means that they use their energy to produce milk. And so that's a quality you like. But as Kate was saying, the flip side then is that means that they don't use that energy to put body weight on. So you have to make that decision of where you want to be in terms of milk production and ability to maintain or at least rebound from a body condition. So our sheep, as dairy sheep, almost all of them will lose significant amount of body weight while they are lactating, particularly the first month or two when they are negative, energy negative, and the amount of energy they can take will be less than what they are using to feed their lamb or when we are milking them. And that is something that is just part of the formula for us, and we know that. And so we have to keep an eye on them that doesn't go too far and they crash. So that's when you start having milk fever, and they will crash because of that. Sheep, because they have a shorter lactation, we can deal with the body condition a little bit easier. If you're following a natural cycle, there's a good chance that you will actually have dried your ewes off before you're ready to breed for the next year. So that gives you a window to give them either, some really great hay, some really great pasture, or some extra grain or something for them to put body weight back on. I know with other animals, I think some dairy goats, which you can milk year round, that can be a little bit of a different issue. I certainly know with cattle, that's a different conversation. But a ewe that after we've milked her and is then not putting body weight back on, I may not breed, either because I don't want those genetics to be continuing because it's a challenge, or maybe it's an age. So I know this year, one of the ewes we won't be breeding because she's getting older. I think she's 8 turning 9. And so sheep will start losing their teeth as they get older, which makes it harder for them to eat enough hay, which is an issue with body weight. So it's just better not to breed her.
And Kate, I know we've talked about this in a previous talk, but can you explain a little bit about, like, when you talked about taking a break, like having one of your goats take a break from breeding, and how I think you've mentioned before that sometimes that's helpful, sometimes that means that their ability to get pregnant or handle pregnancy is affected because they took a break. So can you kind of explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so in general, dairy animals, especially dairy goats, which have come, really have been being cultivated for a long time to really become a good dairy animal, are really meant to be bred year after year. I mean, that's how they do best, as long as you're maintaining, good health and good body condition. But as they get older, it is a little harder for them to get pregnant, and it may become a little harder for them to kid, or if there's a thriftiness issue. So our kind of rule of thumb is what can happen with the older does. And I would say generally, 7 or 8 is starting to get maybe to that age that missing one season, probably okay. But once an older doe has missed 2 seasons, it's going to be really harder potentially for her to kid. It isn't so much that the pregnancy itself is as hard on her, at least that's what I found, but the kidding process, their joints seize up and they're just, everything is tighter, and they tend to have really difficult labors and deliveries. So if we get to an older doe situation, like the doe that I gave the year off last year is in that, right in that, you know, she's going to be 7 next year. So I'll breed her this year. If she doesn't get pregnant this year, I will probably retire her. And I can do that just because we're not trying to be super profitable. They are kind of pets. Now I have another older doe that just stopped being able to get pregnant. Well, she would get pregnant, but she couldn't hold her pregnancies. But and so after 2 seasons, we retired her. But if we decided to breed her again for some reason, one thing we could do is do a planned birth with our vet hospital and take her up there when she's around due date and induce her to go into labor, so that she would be in a place where if there were complications, they could do an emergency C-section, which isn't really that big of a deal on a goat in a planned setting. And so that would be something we might choose to do with a doe where we really liked those bloodlines. We really wanted her to, and this particular older doe that I'm considering it with is probably one of my best milkers. She's really a hardy doe, but she has had a couple of years off now. And so if I do breed her this year, I would probably plan to have her deliver at the vet school. We're just lucky enough to have that nearby. And I feel like it would be a safer thing for her to be in a situation where if she did have a difficult delivery, she'd have some assistance.
So can you guys talk a little bit about what would make you guys, like you said, either retire a sheep or not continue to breed? For rams, it seems like it's genetic. It's not or just he's not functioning as adequately. But when it comes to a ewe who you've had for 8 or 9 years, how do you make that decision to, you know, what are the signs that you see are she's getting too old and we need to, stop using her?
I guess I'll go first in this one. So I haven't been at this farm for 8 or 9 years, so I have not seen one go all the way from the beginning to the end, but we have older animals. And the sheep that I mentioned earlier that I won't be breeding this year, she's being retired because of age. So she always had difficulty putting her weight back on, but she was an excellent milker. We've got some lambs out of her that we are happy with. And so we just won't breed her again, and she will become a pet. Age-wise, the difficulty of previous lambing would be important to me. If they're having a harder time lambing and they're getting older, definitely retire them. As they get older, they will start losing their teeth. And so that's a big one and by teeth, I mean the front. They just have the upper front. And so as they get older, they will start losing those. That means it's harder for them to eat hay or grass. So that's definitely a reason to retire them. Those would be my 2 main ones, or if they've developed udder issues. But if you are doing this as pets, then you might decide to keep an animal around that has had mastitis and maybe 1/2 of the udder is no longer working or continued problem. If you're doing this and you're trying to keep your costs a little bit more in line, once they have an issue, I wouldn't rebreed them again. So that will tend to weed out some of your ewes, and they won't get as old because they might have developed other issues. So I think those would be my three ones, as if they have difficulty keeping on weight, if they are starting to lose their teeth, and if they've got any other issues.
Yeah, so I would say basically we're pretty similar. I mean, we use kind of the arbitrary cutoff date as our age is about 10. Typically dairy goats, 12-ish is their life expectancy, but usually at that point they're dying of something kidding related. And because most of these does were born here, they're pets, they were 4-H goats, we're pretty attached to them. We kind of use 10 years old as sort of an arbitrary cutoff date for when we'll retire them. but we don't stick to that wholeheartedly. It's going to depend a little bit on the doe. So I've had, just like Jacob said, thriftiness is probably my biggest thing. Like, how are they holding their weight throughout the year, but also how are they rebounding after pregnancy? That's probably my number one issue. So any doe that just looks like she's having a little more trouble in terms of maintaining body condition is probably telling me it's good for her not to have that added stress of kidding. Certainly, if we are having udder issues or milk issues, that could make everything much earlier. Luckily, we have not had a lot of that. We've just had good stock to begin with, and we haven't continued breeding a doe that ever had issues. But that would be a reason why I might end things sooner. And then there are some does that might get to 10 and they've just had absolutely no problems getting pregnant, maintaining pregnancy, having babies, staying in condition. And I may go a year or so past that. But I have had a few does, probably 2 or 3 over the years, that it just became obvious by 8 or 9 that it was just getting increasingly more difficult for them. And because we're not trying to be super profitable, we really have that luxury of just retiring them. And sometimes we keep them as a pet, or we find a good home for them that's just looking for a pet or a companion goat. And so we've been able to do that just because our numbers are small.
How do you guys handle either parasites or maybe some other issues that could potentially affect the babies in utero? Can you tell if they're having those type of issues, and how do you figure that out? Or is it really once the lambs come, you kind of know, excuse me, you kind of can tell that something had happened, but it's not, you can't figure that out until after. Because I know some problems arise, and some people are like, I don't know why this baby came out funky, and it was probably because of some sort of parasite that got them early on when they were pregnant. Do you guys find you've had any of those issues? And if you have, was there anything you guys could have done to like figure that out, whether it was stool samples or any of that kind of stuff?
I think that's a really good question, and it's one that I've just struggled with all these years. You know, we the recommendations for us have changed a lot since I started breeding. When we first started, our recommendation here was a 2 times a year parasite prevention and rotating what drug we were using. And over the years, that's really changed to now, at least in our area, the recommendation is only treating when we see symptoms or suspect, and then doing a stool sample so we know what we're treating for. Part of that's drug resistance, and part of that is we're in a pretty dry climate. We don't do a lot of actual pasture raising here. We just don't have the pasture. I mean, we have pasture for them to go out on for recreation. It's not really very much of their nutritional mix. And that's good and bad. In some ways, it's a little easier to control parasites if you're keeping your pens clean than having them going out on pasture all the time. But I often do struggle with that because it isn't a super clear issue sometimes, you know, and again, they say 80% of your parasites are going to be in 20% of your herd. And we have seen that we have 1 or 2. It's probably the first thing I'll look at if I see a lack of thriftiness is I will check. And very rarely is parasites the issue. It just doesn't seem to be a big issue within our herd. Now, once the babies are born, we've had a little bit more issue sometimes with coccidia in kids, but not so much in the adults. So I still find that perplexing though, you know, and like Jacob had mentioned, definitely, you know, looking at membranes and looking for anemia would be an issue, but stool sampling is also just a really good way to check. And most of the time when we've done that, we just haven't found enough to warrant routine treating.
So in terms of parasites, that is definitely an issue for us with sheep. But where we are in the Northeast with our weather and the way our pastures are, I don't find parasites to be an issue around pregnancy. And part of the reason is our biggest parasite is the barber pole worm, which is the worm that lives in their intestine and, takes blood. And so the sheep become anemic. But that is a bigger issue in the spring to the early summer and then early fall. But thankfully, that worm tends to go hibernate in late fall and the winter when they are inside the sheep. So that usually makes it unlikely that you will have a sheep that's anemic while they're pregnant in January or February or March from barber pole worm. But certainly check the eyelids, and you can do fecal samples to tell you if that is an issue. But in the Northeast, that should not really be a problem for you, at least pregnancy rated around. It's certainly a problem other times of the year. So if you are lambing and doing fall lambing, then yeah, that could be it. Then you've got different circumstances going on. The other issue that's rising in the northeast is meningeal worm, which is a worm that has a life cycle between deer and snails. And so we've had some issues with this, but again, because we are lambing in the late winter, early spring, this is not a pregnancy issue for us. It is more an issue in the summer and in the spring. And that presents itself in neurological issues. So they eat grass that's contaminated with this worm, and from my understanding, the worm in a deer can travel up the spine to the brain fine without causing problems, but in sheep they do tend to get lost, and so they will have issues with coordination, and if not treated, they will, they can cause problems, they can die, but thankfully that is fairly treatable. The one thing I would recommend for people raising sheep in the Northeast is have a look at the University of Rhode Island Small Ruminant program. They have some excellent videos online and instructions on how to develop an integrated pest management program. And that goes to what Kate was mentioning about changing recommendations on how to deal with barber pole. So they will show you how to treat and when you should treat and how to make a judgment on when you should treat, rather than just treating on a schedule and treating everyone and then developing resistance, which is happening very quickly.
So we're getting towards the end of the questions, but one of the things I wanted to talk about is, do you guys do anything between breeding and then actually lambing that we have not talked about? I know some people, at least with sheep, will kind of clean up their rear end before the babies come out. I don't know if you guys do any shots beforehand, but is there anything that we haven't discussed that you guys make sure you want to have checked off your list before the babies come?
Yeah, so we generally do a vaccination twice a year, CD&T, which is Clostridium and tetanus. And we do a fall vaccination, but then we also do a spring vaccination. And I usually try to time that about a month before their kidding date. And that gives a little immunity boost to the offspring before their own immune systems kick in, and then they start getting their own series of vaccinations. I know some breeders that don't do that because of some potential complications with the vaccination. We've never had any issues with it, and so we've continued to do that practice. And then just from a physical standpoint, usually about 4 to 6 weeks before due date, I do try to get the does up on the stand, give them a good hoof trimming, because it's just going to be a little harder for them to be handled and jump up on the stand in that last few weeks. And then sometimes if I'm really on top of things and the weather's good and all of that, I will do a little trim up just before they are due to kid around their tail and udder. Just clipping any excess winter hair. And that's just going to make cleanup a little bit easier after kidding. But I usually kind of base that a little bit on weather. I don't want to do too much clipping on an early kidding because we get a lot of late, cold snowstorms. And sometimes it's just timing wise, we just didn't get to it. And it's not that big a deal. We can clip and clean them up a little after they kid. But the vaccination is probably the big thing I try to pretty routinely do. If I haven't done it for some reason, then it just means that my kids are going to get an extra in the series. We do a 2 vaccination 3 weeks apart. But if the mother didn't get vaccinated in that last month, then we would give the kids three vaccinations.
We have a similar program. About 4 weeks, 6 to 4 weeks before lambing, we do CDT shots. Since all of our animals get the shot either before lambing, or if they are newborn, then they get 2 shots. All of them have some immunity, so that shot before the 4 weeks before lambing is simply a booster shot. If your ewe has never had one, then I think the recommendation is they get 2 shots, and you can look up what the timing on that is. But I find that really helpful. It prevents the abortion storms from happening. So that's one shot we do. I know I've had some farms in the area that will also do the vitamin E selenium shots because they've had issues with white muscle weakness. So that's something that you either have a conversation with your vet, or if you've had issues, you might add to your shots. Other than that, we don't do any shots. I know that there are other vaccinations that are recommended, but we haven't had any problems, so we don't do that. And since we do late winter, early spring lambing, we do shearing 4 weeks before pregnancy. It's at the end, so they don't really need the protection of the wool anymore for warmth, and we do indoor lambing, so they are fairly protected, and that allows us to shear them once a year, and they're nice and cleaned up and ready for the lambs. And hoof trimming, I like to do a month or 2 months before if I didn't get to it in the fall, or depending how bad they are. But other than that, getting your lambing supplies ready. There are certain things you'll need, and you can find lists online of what you should get for yourself to just be prepped for lambs, whether that's some energy boosting that you can give the sheep, or if you have to deal with any emergencies. But other than that, it's just ready for the excitement of seeing little lambs running around.
One of the things I think I've missed was talking about a little bit about weather and why we're in Tennessee, so the weather is not as bad as I think you guys get, I think, a lot colder. But can you guys explain why you guys choose to kind of lamb? I think you guys said like March and April is kind of when you start, and why you don't start any sooner, at least for where you guys are.
Yeah, so I would say a lot of the more serious dairy goat farmers in our area will kid in December and January. Actually, March and April, which is traditional kidding season, are our 2 snowiest months in Colorado. So, I mean, sometimes you actually have better weather in December and January, but we can be anywhere on the spectrum. We could have a blizzard in September and May, or we could be 70 degrees in January. So for me, planning around weather for the actual kidding is less important than all the weather surrounding that time, because we could have anything on the day the kids are born. But for me, it's more likely I'm going to have more nice days in the spring. Even if we have a blizzard, it's probably going to warm up faster. And so it does make it a little bit more fun to be out there if you're having to take care of any animals. But I also, I like to have a little bit of time off in the season. And so since I am milking usually through the end of the year, I milk till about Christmas, and then I dry everybody off. That kind of just works for me for kidding, is that everybody's dried off by December. And that means those does that are going to start kidding in March have that last 2 months off. I can go away in February if I want to, because no babies are being fed and no does are in milk. So I really plan it almost more around my personal schedule than the weather, because the weather is just, it's all over the board. But spring kidding is a little bit more traditional, and that's just the time of year that works best for us. If we wait too long, we won't really have good weather till May and June pretty consistently. Well, then those kids are going to get the milk for the first 2 or 3 months. I'm really not even going to have any milk until so late in the fall. And then if I really want to take this break in the winter, it really shortens my milk. So I really like to get the bulk of them done in March and April, just because mostly it fits my schedule more so than the weather issue, because that's so unpredictable.
I think our weather tends to line up a little bit more with the traditional schedule. So I certainly know there are plenty of sheep farmers that around here that will lamb in January and February in the dead of winter. But since we are not trying to extend our season to the max possible, we wait till April. That way, I mean, we can have fluke storms, and we certainly do, but generally the weather has gotten better. It also allows us to have the ewes ready in May when their highest energy needs are when our pasture is starting to grow. So as we tend to have them in the barn in April while they're lambing, and we're looking over them. And then as we get out of April, most of them are done lambing, and we're going into May, and our pastures are starting to spring up. So that's a great time for us to have our ewes needing a lot of energy and fresh forage, and for the lambs to start nibbling on it. So that just makes sense for us to do that. But I certainly think personal schedules are very important. And so, that doesn't make it a hard and fast rule. So if something makes it easier for you, you certainly can change it around. And since the ewes have a shorter lactation, we tend to be done by the early fall, maybe mid-fall. So if you wanted to extend your milking season, I know some farms will do an early lambing in January and then another one later, maybe April, May, and that allows them to milk closer to December. So, I mean, part of it's tradition, and then I think personal schedule and goals are very important there.
Yeah, and I would just really piggyback on that especially for the hobby farmer, which I think is what most of the people are that are going to be watching this, it's really important that you make this work for you, because burnout is really high for people who had this dream of doing this homestead and getting these animals, and then you really aren't managing to what works best for you and your family and your situation. And then pretty soon this dream is just a nightmare. And so I think it is really important for the hobby farmer to definitely take a huge healthy consideration of what works for you and your family and your schedule. Because if you want to do it for the long run, you've got to do something that's going to work for you. So not to shy away from that. There is nothing wrong with making this work for you just as much as you're making it work for the animals.
And I'll just add to that sometimes it takes a while to figure out what works.
Yeah, that is so true.
And you think it's a great plan, and then you get into it and you live it, and you're like, this is not working for me. And instead of just throwing it all out the window and going, this is just not going to work at all, it could just be that it just needs a little bit of tweaking to make it work for you. Because at least on my end, I did not grow up on a farm. I'm a city girl who just happens to now have sheep. And so there's a lot of learning that's going on, and a lot of, well, this sounded really good at the time, but then you get more information, or you just get real life experience and go, this is not going to work for me. Or the sheep or the goats or whatever tell you it's not going to work. Because a lot of times they're the ones who are changing your plans. So just to kind of keep that in mind, that, sometimes it takes a little bit of finessing for you to figure out what works for you. So for our last little thing, do you guys want to share any words of wisdom, any other tips or tricks that maybe we didn't cover when it comes to breeding or just pregnancy care? Maybe some mistakes you guys made that you guys learned from and are doing differently, either next year or just currently. So yeah, just some things you want to share with the audience before we head out.
Yeah, well, I would say, and I think I say this in every one of my sessions, because I just feel like it's so important, especially if you're new to things, is definitely to have a good community and know your resources and tap into them early and often. Don't go it alone. I mean, reading is great, and being, informed about things through books is important, but there's nothing more valuable than human resources and cultivating those before you need them. So, if you are, really new to it, you definitely want to have a vet or two or three that you actually know. Don't call them for the first time when you're in the middle of a kidding emergency. You want to develop that relationship with them long before you really, really need them, and know how available are they, and are they available for a phone call, not just for an office visit? Would they be available in the middle of the night if you're having an emergency? And then not only of that, but there's a lot of really, well educated and really friendly, just people who, in the community that would be willing to help out. So having a good mentor, somebody that's been doing this for a while. If you have 4-H in your community, that's a great place to have a resource of a lot of people with a lot of experience. And I just don't think you can overstate how important that is, to have somebody to call. And, in the first year, you're probably going to use a vet a lot more than you really financially wish you had. And it's important to do. You're going to save animals. You're going to save yourself some peace of mind. But over the long run, you just can't call the vet every time there's an issue and have them out. And so developing some other resources besides your vet, or in addition to your vet, that are other people that you can call that have maybe a little more wisdom than you do. And then you will be that person eventually for a whole new group of people that are coming on board. So I'd say that's my always number one piece of advice.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. I think with sheep, lambing is the big, what people get most nervous about, or seems like the biggest hurdle. And, it's certainly, there can be complicated things, but it also often just goes excellent. It's just a little harder to remember that. You remember the times when you were really in the corner and you weren't quite sure what to do. So I would second developing that community, talk to other sheep and goat farmers. I mean, there's a lot of similarities. If you have the chance and you're thinking about starting, but you haven't, depending on how many animals a farm has, lambing can be pretty hectic, and farms will often be very will be very open to you helping them out. And that might just mean you being there for certain hours and keeping an eye on things, or being there when lambing happens. And that's a great way to learn some of the tricks of what to do. But, forgive yourself when you didn't do things the way you thought you wanted to, or the way you'd have liked to go them, because things will always, there will always be new things to learn, and there are always hurdles that come up, and you can figure them out with your community and with the vet. The way Kate said, develop that relationship with your vet, and it's a good idea to get to know your vet in your area. It's both important for the vet, for they have a business that they need to keep going, and not all vets are that comfortable working with small ruminants. So it's good for you to have an idea of where they are and what kind of services they can provide for you. The only other thing I think I would add is take a lot of notes of what you're doing, and what happened, how did you respond, and what was the outcome. I think when we're in the moment, it's like, yes, I will remember this. I know exactly what I did next year. I will know this, but so much will happen, you will actually forget. And if you have some notes, if nothing else, it will give you the confidence to say, oh yes, I know exactly what happened, or I know exactly what I did. You won't be second guessing yourself. So I think that can make you feel a little bit more comfortable and sure in yourself if you've got good notes of the way, any treatments or what you've done with your animals. Yeah.
Can you guys real quick share where they can follow you, or for your businesses, if you guys can just share the media, how they can follow you and all that good stuff, so that they can continue following you guys on your journey?
Sure. So I work for a different farm. It's called Lillooet Sheep and Cheesery in Boxford, Massachusetts. They are on Facebook or Instagram. I have my own page. At this point, the one and really only way to follow me would be to follow my Instagram page, which is Dirt Grass Hope. And I don't know if my name is on there yet or not, but yeah, I'm Jacob. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I have only been on the sheep particular end of this journey for 3 years now, so I'm learning and realizing I have a lot to learn, but I'm certainly happy to share what I have experienced and what I have learned, and always interested in learning more from other farmers who are working with sheep and goats.
Yeah, and I have my main website is my cheese making school, which is theartofcheese.com. There is a page on that website for my farm. And you can also go to briargatefarm.com and it will take you to that page. I used to maintain 2 websites and that just seemed silly. So that's one way you can find me. And then I am on Facebook and Instagram. So for the Facebook, I actually keep 2 professional pages. There's Art of Cheese and Briargate Farm. So those are my 2 farm and cheese related Facebook pages. And then for Instagram, it's really, it's more cheese centric, but there's lots of goat stuff on there as well. And that's the Art of Cheese Longmont. If you do go to Instagram in particular, I think, well, both Facebook and Instagram, I also used to do a series, I think I did it for about 8 months, called Monday Morning from the Milk House. And so all those videos are still there. And they were just every Monday morning, and I'll probably resume it again in the spring. I would do about a 20-minute video on something having to do with goat keeping. So that's also just a fun way to get a little more information from me and how I raise goats.
Great.
So I guess
guys.
I should also mention, I would probably be remiss to say that if you are looking for a publication, I am a writer for Countryside Network's Goat Journal. And so I also do write a lot of goat keeping and cheese making articles for them. And they are a really good resource if you're just looking for a good overall goat type of resource. That's also a good one, and you'll find me there too.
Great. Thank you guys so much for coming on and talking about this. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot through every single interview because I'm kind of in the same place as Jacob, where we're still within our first year. So there is a lot that I'm learning, and I'm so excited to share with everybody else who's just getting started into this, all this information, because like you guys said, books are great, but a lot of times it's the hands-on real life experience. And a lot of other times you get a lot of the information from large companies, but you don't always get the, oh, I just have 3 or 4 in my backyard and we milk, 2 of them. Kind of a thing. So I just appreciate you guys taking the time out to come and talk to me and share all of the information, all the experience you guys have. It's been an amazing experience for me, so I'm really excited to share this with everybody.
Well, thanks for doing it, especially in the situation you're in, being a new mom again. Yeah, that's impressive.
Yes, very impressive. Thank you, Delaney, for organizing this.